Hola y bienvenidos al Español 102. Today we're talking about los verbos irregulares en el pretérito, about conjugating several irregular verbs in the preterite tense. As a quick review of where we are in the course of learning about Spanish verbs, we've learned that there are 4 classes of verbs: AR verbs, ER verbs, IR verbs, and irregular verbs. AR, ER, and IR refer to the end of the verb when it's in the infinitive. For example, some AR verbs are hablar, tomar, llegar, llevar, etc. A few examples of ER verbs: comer, tejer. Some IR verbs are vivir, escribir, etc. And then irregular verbs are verbs like hacer, estar, ser, dar, ir, some of those verbs that are often very common verbs, but they don't follow the regular patterns of regular AR, ER, or IR verbs. And each of these classes of verbs has its own conjugation pattern. Conjugation is changing the forms of the verb depending on the subject. For example, in English, with the verb to be, the conjugations would be I am, you are, he or she is, we are, they are. Those would be considered the conjugations of the verb to be in English. Verbs in Spanish have conjugations, and there are more verb conjugations in Spanish than there are in English, more variety in the verb conjugations. So let's look at some irregular verbs in the preterite tense. The preterite tense is the simple past tense that we've been learning since chapter 7. So let's look at the verb hacer, which we already learned from chapter 7. It was one of the 4 irregular verbs that we learned in chapter 7. We learned hacer, dar, ir, and ser. The verb hacer has these conjugations: yo hice, tú hiciste, él, ella, usted hizo, nosotros hicimos, vosotros hicisteis, and ellos, ellas, ustedes hicieron. So we took the stem, the HAC, and that had a spelling change. It changed to HIC in the conjugated verbs. And then it took on these endings. For yo, it took on e, tú, iste, él, ella, usted, o, nosotros himos, vosotros histeis, and ellos, ellas, ustedes hieron. And all of the verbs that we're going to learn today, we're going to learn several verbs that all follow this same pattern. They'll have a spelling change in the stem, and they'll take on these endings: e, iste, o, himos, histeis, hieron. And notice that there are no accent marks on any of those stems, or on any of those endings. For regular verbs, there's always an accent mark on the yo and the el, ella, usted endings. But for these irregular verbs, there is no accent mark. So here are the spelling changes. For estar, the stem changes to ESTUV. Poder, PUD, poner, PUS, querer, QUIS, saber, SUP, tener, TUV, venir, VIN, decir, DIJ, and traer, TRAJ. And then it takes these endings, the e, iste, o, himos, histeis, hieron, that you learned with the verb hacer in the preterite tense. So for example, if we look at the verb estar, it would become estuve, estuviste, estuvo, estuvimos, estuvisteis, and estuvieron. For venir, the conjugations would be with the stem VIN, and then those endings that we learned with hacer. The conjugations would be vine, viniste, vino, vinimos, vinisteis, and vinieron. One thing to keep in mind is that there is a slight difference with these last 2 verbs, decir and traer. Because those stems end with a J, we don't include the I in the ellos, ellas, ustedes. So you'll notice that sometimes. It's not a big thing that you have to make extra sure that you memorize, but that is the correct conjugation for those, is without the I in the ellos, ellas, ustedes. So it's dijeron and trajeron. So just to recap, at the end of this presentation, there is a class of verbs that are irregular in the present tense. They are also irregular in the preterite tense. And they follow the same pattern that we learned in chapter 7 for hacer, where they have a spelling change in the stem and they take on some irregular endings: e, iste, o, imos, istes, and yeron, which are kind of a combination of the AR and ER-IR preterite tense endings that we learned for regular verbs, but without any accent marks. So be sure to do the workbook activities that go along with this lesson and continue to practice the preterite tense of these irregular verbs.